With this blues riffs lesson, we're going to take another step closer to being able to improvise while soloing. And that next step is to start applying variations to blues riffs that you already know. With variations, you're going to start rearranging riffs with the more spontaneous or creative approach, and that's very different from learning to copy riffs note for note. So if you haven't yet tried variations, it's more challenging than you think, especially when it comes to playing with the backing rhythm. So what we're going to do with this lesson is show you how to start applying variations with a step-by-step approach. Before you try variations, you should already have a foundation of blues soloing basics down, and that starts with knowing the standard pentatonic minor box pattern and being able to play a handful of riffs in different keys with this pattern. You should also have some blues technique down as well, and that includes bending, vibrato, hammering, pulling off, and phrasing. And finally, you should have some experience in playing these riffs over a backing rhythm. Now you can review any of these topics with my previous lessons, but otherwise, let's get started with using variations. We're going to start by applying variations to a riff that I refer to as the blues riff. It's a standard riff, and here's how it sounds. In the initial approach, when I introduce students to riffs, especially beginners, is we copy the riffs verbatim. In other words, note for note, exactly as they are. Same approach as when you first learn to read or write. When you copy sentences, you don't rearrange the words. You repeat them exactly as they are, and then you have a good foundation to build on that. And the same approach when it comes to learning riffs. You learn them note for note, and then we add a collection of riffs, so they're able to play a bunch of riffs together, and usually over a backing rhythm for about maybe 30 seconds or a minute, whatever. But then comes the time for the variations lesson, and a lot of times, I'll say to a student, okay, take that standard blues riff that you've had down now for a month or so, and show me a variation of it, play something different. And the reaction I get is usually a blank stare. And the reason why is, usually when you're first learning riffs, we're applying a paint-by-numbers approach. In other words, we're showing you exactly what to do, note for note. When all of a sudden you're presented with sort of a blank canvas and asked to be creative, that's usually asking a bit much. It's kind of like asking a kindergartner to sort of write stories when they're first learning to copy sentences. So the solution, the best way to start with variations, is to apply variations one note at a time. So going back to the blues riff, here's a quick review of it. Now the one-note variation, what we're going to do is we're going to start the riff off pretty much exactly as it was played before, same notes. And here's the variation coming up. We're going to go to that third string, fifth fret, and then back down to the root note, as opposed to playing that root note twice. So again, here's the original riff. And here's the variation. And this is the best way to sort of break out of that rut of constantly repeating the same riffs over and over again. Start with a one-note variation. So from a one-note variation, we can build on that and add additional notes at the end of the riff. So here we go again, starting off the same. And then, boom, bum, boom, bum, bum. Just going back and forth between that fourth string, seventh fret and the third string, fifth fret. Boom, bum, and ending on the root note. So here's that variation again. Another way we can do a variation with the same riff by repeating notes is to repeat the opening notes of the riff. So it starts with the bend and then the top two strings. We can repeat that phrase or play it 3 consecutive times. Let's do that one again. Before we go over other riffs with other variations, it's a good idea to review what we just covered by playing these riffs over a backing rhythm. So in the next clip, we have a 12-bar rhythm in the key of A blues. It's a great way to practice these riffs. Sometimes when you play them over a backing rhythm, it can throw you off a little bit. So if you can throw in these variations with the backing rhythm, you'll be ready for the next step. Here's another riff we did in a previous lesson. It's a standard riff that I call the bend and release riff. And again, we'll start with the one-note variation. It's going to start the same, but this time we go back down to the root, the 4th string, and then a little back and forth between the 3rd string and the root note. So that 3-note ending, there's your variation. And we'll back it up, we'll do a comparison. Here's the original. And here's the variation. Now sometimes rather than adding an additional note, you throw in a different blues technique on a riff. So it's taking the same riff. Here's what I mean. We're going to do a little bend on that note to end the riff. And here's what I mean. So putting those three together, we'll start with the original, then the first variation, and the last variation. Then here's the first variation. And then the last variation. Now you can hear examples of variations applied to one riff in some famous songs. In fact, years ago, after showing one of my students the bend and release riff in A, he pointed out to me about a week later that he heard this riff, or he recognized it, in a song by Led Zeppelin called Heartbreaker. In the middle of the song, during the guitar solo section, he does some variations on that bend and release riff. In fact, I'll play it. It's not going to be exact, but it's pretty close. And here's the example. So hopefully you can see it's variations, including some bending techniques applied to one riff to build a guitar solo. Another idea to add variations to riffs you already know is to take portions of riffs and to splice them together to form one riff. And here's an example. We're going to take the Doublestops riff. Again, we did this in a previous lesson. Well, we can do a variation of that and splice it together, say, with the original blues riff we covered a couple chapters back. So how will we splice them together? Why not take the beginning of that riff, and then instead of playing individual notes, just play the double stops instead. Let's do that one again. And then from there, you can even take another riff, a third riff that we did, maybe a portion of the bend and release riff, putting that all together. So that's an example of splicing from three riffs, putting them together to form one new variation, one new riff. Here's an example of a variation from a hammer riff that we did in a previous lesson. Here's the original hammer riff. Well, we could splice that together again with a bend and release. And then, let's do that one again. You can also apply variations with the basic pentatonic minor box pattern, and for a lot of you, that's how you first started to play the blues, was with an ascending, descending run with the pentatonic minor box pattern. Well, within the context of a guitar solo, an ascending or descending run, even just partially going down the pattern, could work. See how we're kind of combining that with some other riffs? Kind of stopping on the root notes. There's a descending run right there. You can also apply passing tones to variations, and here's a passing tones riff we did from a previous lesson. Again, that example's an A, and the key is knowing where those extra 3 notes are that you throw in, those extra passing tones. If you know that, you've got a lot of options for variations. And here's one where we splice together some passing tones with the hammer riff. So again, there's a hammer riff, right? Well, what if we threw in hammered some passing tones on that riff instead? I'll do that one again. Now we could also add a variation to the ending with what we did previously with that bend and release. Adding that to the riff, substituting that for the root note. Check this out. And I'll do that one again. Now, up to this point in the lesson, we've provided all the examples of variations. The next challenge is for you to try and create variations on your own. And that's what improvisation is all about, being creative or spontaneous with the scales that you know. And the only way to do that, the only way to break out of that habit of always repeating the same old riffs, is to start to explore or swim around those box patterns. And we've only worked with one box pattern this lesson, so as long as you stay within that box pattern, all the variations you try out are going to harmonize, especially if you're playing with the backing rhythm. Now, coming up, we're going to have another backing rhythm track. This time you can try your variations out in a different key. But before we do that rhythm track, a couple of pointers. Number one, you might want to use the same approach we did with the examples. In other words, you want to start off with one note variations, and then as you get more comfortable with that, start to build up. And then once you start building up, you want to apply also a root note focus. What I mean by that is phrasing your riffs beginning and ending on the root notes. Now, you don't always have to do that, but early on, if you apply that root note focus while you're trying out these new variations, it's simply going to sound just a little bit more cohesive with that backing rhythm. As long as you keep working at variations, eventually you're going to come up with some riffs on your own that might surprise you in how good they sound, especially if you're practicing with the backing rhythm. And that's what's referred to as a happy accident. And a lot of the classic blues and rock solos that you know are the result of happy accidents. It's when the artist is simply improvising, adding variations, and they happen to just catch that moment on tape. So that's another idea, is to record yourself while you're trying these out. And then when you listen back, you might hear a riff and keep it for yourself, add it to your collection of riffs, and that's what's referred to as a signature riff. Now, every riff we've covered in this lesson is movable. In other words, you can play these riffs and variations in different keys. And since everything we've done so far has been the key of A, we're going to change things up. In the next and final clip, we're going to have a backing rhythm, a blues shuffle in the key of B. So you can work out the variations in a different key. And also, on the video on the screen, you can see there'll be a list of some of the variations we did to give you some ideas while you're trying out new riffs.